Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Eric Hobsbawm. Eric, I will start by asking when and where you were born.
I was born in Alexandria, Egypt, with which I have absolutely no personal connection. My only connection is, as it were, through official documents, from which I have never been able to escape, because they contain, I was registered at the British Consulate in Alexandria, and my birth certificate contains 2 errors with which I've had to live forever. One, they misspelled my name, and B, they got the date of my birth one day wrong.
The misspelling of the name meant that you weren't Hobsbawm with a U, was it, or?
B-A-U-M was the name of the family. What it was originally is something else. My suspicion is it was Hobsbawm. It's the only thing. But there is no way of verifying this.
What effect is being one day older or younger than you should be, what effect has that had on your life?
The only effect is that I have to live with what it says on my documents, not with what I know to be true.
Right. Tell me about as far back on your either your mother's or your father's side as you like to go. Some people go back to the Norman Conquest, but you don't need to go that far. But grandparents, or?
Yes. I don't think I can trace it better back to beyond the grandparents. On the other hand, on my father's side, my grandparent was probably born around 1838. Died in 1927. He was a Jewish cabinet maker by trade. He migrated to England in the early 70s, between 1872 and 1874. He was already a widower then. He migrated with the daughter of his first marriage and with one child of his second marriage. And the rest of my uncles and father were then already born in England from 1870 on.
Where did they migrate from?
So far as I'm aware, Warsaw.
And for a particular reason, or push or pull, or?
There's no way. I mean, we simply don't know. I mean, he died before I knew him. The rest of the family didn't really know very much about it either, or didn't want to talk about it. Might have been for any reasons, except he did migrate before the main migration from Eastern Europe, the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe started. They first registered in the census in 1881. As usual, misspelled the name, because it's most incredibly misspelling name.
Yes.
Almost impossible. I've kept it only largely out of principle, and because in order nobody should suggest that I changed a name which conceivably sounded Jewish. You see. So otherwise, it would certainly have, if we'd still lived in an oral society, it would have gradually, so to speak, weathered down into either Hobson or Osborne or something like that. But it didn't. And so my family had been stuck with this odd thing, including the initial H, which I suspect came originally because my father must have landed in London, and as he was illiterate in English anyway, he must have dictated his name, and a name Hobsbawm would obviously acquire an H when taken down by a Cockney customs officer. Whatever it is, anybody with an H in this name is a direct descendant of my grandfather. My grandmother died much younger, long before I was born. On my mother's side, my grandfather was somewhat younger, was born about 1869 or thereabouts. The family, they weren't really allowed to go into Vienna. Jews weren't allowed into Vienna before the 1840s, except for a small privileged minority. They originally came from this curious area roughly where Austria and Czechoslovakia and Slovakia and Hungary meet. These various areas around, probably the Moravian side rather than the Hungarian or the Slovak side, but we don't anyway. But by the time that I knew anything about the family, they had migrated to Vienna. My father's family remained, as it were, well, he remained in the cabinet-making trade. Sometimes they were workers, sometimes independent, sometimes, but anyway, that was family trade. At least one of his sons carried on for a while afterwards. The others didn't. I think it was, in every respect, a fairly undistinguished family. It had no record of education, learning, business activity or business success. And in fact, mostly it remained, the English part of it remained, as it were, on the very lowest slopes, just where workers had just emancipated themselves and become, you know, lower middle class or highly skilled. I mean, the sons became post office workers, teachers, that sort of thing. Only one actually managed somehow to get some kind of secondary education, and he became a chemist and then emigrated and eventually to Chile, where most of the descendants were then of the Hobsbawms were then born. I was the first, I think, member of the family to go full-time to university. At least one of the others managed at the same time to do part-time higher education and worked their way up, eventually to become quite an important, my cousin Roland, quite an important statistician in the Ministry of Labour. But starting right at the bottom, you see, minor manipulative grades, clerical grades, then via various exams. I was really the first of the generation, and the family didn't. Well, there's not a great deal to be said, except that it was a family which stuck together, at least in England. A number of them left England because this was the era of imperialism, for Egypt. Two of the brothers went to Egypt, one went to Chile, yes. Mostly came back, but the basis of the English family remained. My Uncle Harry, who eventually became the first Labour mayor of the borough of Paddington in London, who was a telegraphist all his life, even during the war, the Great War, which he passed partly in the Western Front, and luckily for himself, after the Italian defeat at Caporetto in Egypt. So that. The mother's family was really sort of middle class. Business. My grandfather's trade was jewellery. They made jewels, but of course that collapsed after the First World War. My grandfather ended his career, as no doubt he began as a commercial traveller through alpine villages with, you know, small things, but up to the end of the war, he was doing quite well, which is, the girls, it was a much more cultured family. My father's family, their essence of their culture was that they assimilated to become very English, as English as it possibly could, as fast as it could. And they succeeded quite largely. My mother's family shared Central European Habsburg culture. And I got a lot out of that. In neither case were they very successful in material terms. Do you want anything more about the family?
Yeah, well, I mean, you may not want to talk about it, we can, but I gather your father died when you were about 12, and your mother when you were about 14,
Yes.
is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, is it worth mentioning that, or at least asking, I mean, that's not absolutely normal even at that time. How did that happen?
Well, I've described this at some length in my autobiography, so I don't really want to go through it again.
We'll just mention it then.
I mean, my father effectively, although he joined my mother after the First World War in Austria, because she was very nostalgic, and he brought some savings in hard currency there, which made him feel very successful, but he proved to be totally incapable of earning a living on his own. He was one of these people who would have done extremely well, who had done extremely well in the sort of British colonial situation where a good young man, very good at sports. He was actually championship class boxer, lightweight, and with a certain amount of, social graces. He played piano and that sort of stuff. Could always find a job in some kind of import-export agency or some kind of other office, and there was no real problem there. But plunged into Austria after the First World War and trying to make his own living as an independent businessman of some kind or other, never knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was a total failure. Put a lot of stress on the family, at least on my mother. And I mean, this was very, very bad times indeed. And it drove him to desperation, and eventually, I mean, he died on some awful moment coming during a bad winter, coming back, died in front of the house. My mother could not forgive herself for, in fact, having berated him about not being able to give it. And this is a situation where, you know, she wrote to her sister before Christmas saying, I don't know what we shall do at Christmas. I haven't got enough money, let alone not to pay the gas bill, let alone for present for the children. And the mother then, after his death, in effect, I think she, I won't say she committed suicide, but I mean she
Let herself die.
She let herself, she what was working, what was going, and I mean anyway, within a few months, she got a very bad infection, lung infection, and within 2 years she was dead. But fortunately, of course, my father and mother's brother had married each other's brother and sister.
Mm.
So I mean, 2 sisters had married 2 brothers, and I and my sister were taken over by the uncle and aunt, who were, as it were, doubly close. And we then went to Berlin, where I stayed until it came to.
Is there anything about the character of either your own parents or the parents who took you over which you think is important to stress, obviously relating to your later activities as an academic or historian? Were any of them very ambitious or literary or?
My mother was literary. I mean, in fact, she wrote a novel too, in German and then translated. I mean, the family's literary interests. I mean, intelligent young women in Vienna, for instance, they were great followers of Karl Kraus and all the other people like that, and they circulated with other intellectuals, intelligent people. She wasn't ambitious for herself. It would have been enough to earn enough money to get by. I think she had hopes for me, but they were kind of romantic hopes. She hoped, for instance, and she was very, very Anglophile. And as I was interested in things like birds and stuff, she thought, oh, well, perhaps when he grows up he can join the Indian Forestry Service. She was a great admirer of Kipling, Jungle Book and stuff like that, you see. But beyond that, I don't think she had. And anyway, I mean, she died before there was really any prospect of doing it. My father, I don't know anything about him. I mean, I don't remember anything about him effectively. And clearly I didn't have very good relations with him. He tried to teach me boxing and it didn't work. Well, my second father, if you like, and their uncle, he, I think, had ambitions. He had ambitions for himself. He always wanted to be something other than simply a businessman. And I mean, he would always try to be a businessman in either in music, in show business, in culture, you know. He always made some contact with some kind of operatic singer whom he wished to promote and stuff like that. But, and eventually he talked himself into the movie business for a bit. And that's really what gave him his thrills. But his real ambition was that he was an extremely good chess player, which is how he got during World War One. He got into intelligence during. But in those days, being an extremely good chess player was not a professional qualification for anything else. So there's nothing much he could do with it.
Mm.
But he did sort of realize that he thought that I was very bright, and he did his best to push me, though he had no idea of how to go about it.
What is your first memory, I mean solid memory, beyond just the sun shining through your pram or whatever, but a striking memory of your childhood?
Well, as I say, in the relatively short period when my father still thought he had some money, we lived in a very elaborate apartment, in a very elaborate villa, which you can still see as you come into Vienna by train from the west. And there we were two families. And indeed, that was sort of based as a family. I mean, we made friends with local family, which had 4 girls. And of course, our own family used to come. So I can remember those meetings in the terrace. There was this uncle or that uncle turning up. It was very nice. And it's also, as I say in my autobiography, my first real political memory, though I didn't know it, when they, in 1923, during the French occupation of the Ruhr, they evacuated German children from the Ruhr to places like Austria, you see, and 1, 2 were in our class, and I took one into our garden and showed him how to climb a favourite tree and so on, and he explained to me. As I say, I remember the experience, but in retrospect, I can see that it was a unique my first political experience, you see.
Mm. Mm. What was the first school you went to? Was that in Vienna?
Primary school in
Vienna?
In the suburb of Vienna, yes.
Mm.
In Hacking, yes.
Do you remember anything about that? Any of the teachers or?
No. No, I don't remember any primary. I remember the school, very nice. I remember going around. They were very keen. Actually, it was quite a good backing for history, because in fact there was a lot about the Viennese past, and people used to take us out for walks in the hills and say, oh well, here there's records of cavemen and stuff like this, and we used to go around chasing and say maybe we could find some fossil, you know, that kind of stuff like this. And insofar as we heard about history, it wasn't about the boring things, you know, but about things like, you know, when the Turks besieged Vienna after that, and they left their coffee there, and that was the beginning of the coffee houses, and that kind of stuff, you see, which registered. Well, it's the sort of thing which does register with children, quite unlike the official lists of kings and cabinets and battles. So to that extent. Then after I went to 3 secondary schools in Vienna. Things got disrupted after the death of my father. And then a 4th in Berlin. So I had a somewhat disrupted secondary education.
Were there any teachers during that secondary period who influenced you a lot?
I don't remember any of the Austrian teachers, great teachers, except the last one in the 18th district, because he was at the same time a football commentator, and therefore known to be a football commentator, Schmieger. And naturally this gave him a degree of profile, but I'm not certain that I developed any kind of personal relationship with any of them then. Unlike the secondary school teachers in Berlin and then later on in London.
How long were you at these schools in Vienna? Or
2 years at the school in 13th district, 1 year at the 3rd district, which is just opposite the house Wittgenstein built himself, 1 year in the 18th district. So it was a bit of a disruption. And then 18 months, I suppose, in Berlin.
what age were you when you came back to England, roughly?
I was just coming up to, you see, up to 16 in the UK. Huh?
What you mentioned earlier that you were interested in birds. I mean, were there other hobbies that were important? And what, I mean, was it collecting birds' eggs, or was it looking at birds, or?
Oh, just looking at birds, not so much collecting birds' eggs, no. I mean, I still remember, again I mention it in my autobiography, the last time I saw my mother, who was dying in a sanatorium, and other people were around, and I didn't quite know what to do, and I looked out of the window and I saw a hawfinch, which is one of the ones, you know, these huge beaks, which can, in German it's called Kirschkernbeißer, cherry stone biter, you see, huh? And that is, in a sense, my last living memory of my mother, while she was there dying and me looking out at this bird.
You weren't a sportsman, it sounds, or a sports person?
Not much. No, I joined the Boy Scouts in the last year, coming back. After my father died, I visited England. There was some hope I might stay in England with another sister of my mother's, but it didn't work out. But nevertheless, I mean, I acquired a taste for the Boy Scouts and joined them when I got back to Vienna. I might have stuck with the Boy Scouts if there had been any in Germany, but there weren't.
It mentions that, this may be apocryphal, but I think in one of the articles on you, it mentions that you became an au pair and taught English. That sounds rather bizarre.
No, not at all. I mean, it's a bit difficult. You see, after my mother got ill and therefore in effect got into hospital, couldn't look after anybody, my uncle and aunt already took my sister to Berlin, you see. I stuck around in Vienna for another year or so, but at one time I was supposed to live with some relatives, and then somehow that didn't last. So somebody arranged to put me into the house of a lady not too far from the new school, where in effect I was supposed to talk English to the young boy, Mrs. Effenberger, who was some kind officer's widow, originally born in Bohemia. And I did that, and then I used to go and visit my mother in hospital every week or so. Not a very successful year.
Were any of your, either your real parents or your later adopted parents, and they were all Jewish, but were any of them, were they secularized Jews or practicing?
Totally. I mean, I don't think I ever went to a synagogue except for a funeral. I may have gone once for somebody's wedding, but I mean, as far as I'm aware, my father's generation was also pretty completely secularized. So, I mean, religion wasn't...
They didn't have any of the commemorations or feasts or abstentions or anything?
No. No, not at all. I mean, it was so secularized that I didn't even know until I got... until I reached puberty that I'd been circumcised, which is what my mother had done, in, you know, because her parents still insisted to some extent. I mean, I was never bar mitzvahed. I mean, I got some Jewish instruction because the Jews in school were dispensed from, you know, they went and got some religious instructions somewhere in the afternoon in another school by a series of people. But, I mean, they even taught me bits and pieces of the sort of things, you know. I still know some of the things you're supposed to say at Passover, the youngest son. Never used it. I've never attended a Seder in my life. Or, I mean, there's no question about religion or religious practice. But at the same time, of course, it was completely clear to anybody in Central Europe whether you were Jewish or not, because, I mean, the rest of the world regarded Jews as people being Jewish and different. As I try to explain, my main principle on religion is the one which was inculcated in my mother at some time when she heard me making some kind of undesirable remark about this so-called Jewish behavior which one of my uncles or somebody else had done. He says, you must never under any circumstances say anything or do anything that might suggest that you're ashamed of being Jewish. And that was enough, really. So in some ways, I mean, for instance, I mean, normally in Austria and between the wars, it was legally possible at the age of reaching the age of 13 to declare yourself confessionslos, without faith, without religion, which of course I would have done except for this principle. I said, you know, nobody, what? It must not be misunderstood, you know, that kind of business. But I don't think beyond that it does, alas, it doesn't mean that one wasn't part of the Jewish problem or involved in these matters, but not from the point of view of traditional religion and practice, religious practice.
Do you I mean, some people have speculated that in some ways being Jewish and being aware of it has influenced the way you've looked at things like nationalism or the invention of tradition or whatever. Do you think that is the case? I know why I asked this is I've a number of, obviously, of the distinguished people I've talked to, like Lisa Jardine or Simon Schaffer and others, have wondered about whether being both within society and outside it at the same time has made them more self-aware and aware of constraints of the culture they live in.
Difficult to judge from my own point of view. I mean, especially as, on the whole, while I was engaged in either in history or in political activities, I didn't very much see myself, I mean, being Jewish was not a thing that's particularly significant. In some ways, I mean, I sympathize very much with the view when that Gombrich, the art historian, expressed when somebody said, "Can you tell us about the Jewish culture of Vienna?" And he said, "There was no Jewish culture of Vienna. I was brought up in the middle-class culture of Vienna." You see? The fact that the people who practiced it were Jewish is not, didn't seem to him. So, seen from outside, it may, I mean, I think it's fairly clear that having lived a life between cultures and moving from one place to another, or if you like, being member of a kin group which was distributed over various areas of this globe, in Europe and elsewhere, does give you a slightly different angle on nations and nationalism, but it doesn't actually make you, as you know, immune to nationalism, because, I mean, all I can say is I never fell for the Jewish nationalism, possibly because it seemed to me to be too much the opposite number to the German nationalism which surrounded me. Just Zionism, of course.
Yes, yes. I mean, just to finish on this sort of area, did religion become important at all to you later in your life in any way, or is it something you're interested in, or was it just something that wasn't really relevant?
Of course I'm interested in it. And indeed, I mean, it's something which clearly, one comes across in one's work. I mean, I came across it in one's work very much, for instance, when I was working on the pre-political movements of social protest. The language in which they spoke was a religious language. I would also say that, I mean, one would recognize the force of the religious sentiment in some cases. It's very clear, for instance, insofar as I got interested in jazz and black music and so on, that gospel and spirituals and stuff like this were genuinely expressions of something that was profoundly important to the people concerned, even though it wasn't profoundly important to me. So to this extent, I mean, I'm not anti. I mean, I don't reject this. I accepted this. To me personally, religion hasn't. No, I mean, it's as far as I can see.
let's bring you to England then. At about the age of 16, and where did you go to school there?
I went to school. I stayed at first. The family moved in little bits and pieces. I first stayed with this uncle, the telegraphist, Uncle Harry, and he arranged for me to go to the school where his son had gone to, which is St Malvern Grammar School, which lasted, well, it was a very good school. I mean, it was one of those, it was a London County Council school in those days. It tried, and tried to follow the basic style of public schools, which irritated a number of us enormously. But it was a very good school, at least for people coming. I mean, I can remember the first interview with the headmaster was a man called Philip Wayne, who eventually produced a translation of Faust for the Penguin Classics, I think, who apologized to me that they said, we shan't be able to teach you Greek because we only teach Latin here. Eventually the school we got to teaching Greek, but by that time it was too late. But then he immediately pressed into me. He said, yes, now here's this volume of Kant. You might be interested in this. And the other thing I remember immediately, he said, you must read Hazlitt. Huh? So, I mean, it was very clear that this is a man who was, I think he obviously thought, I looked fairly promising. But at all events, these were people who clearly took an interest in and were good at I managed to get through the what in those days called the matric, which would nowadays be called GCSEs, in about 2 or 3 months. Never having done these things before, but I mean, I sort of worked on these things for the first few months and managed to do that, so I could go straight into well, effectively 6, you see, huh? And the arts, 6. So, I'm bound to say I owe them a great deal, because I mean, you see, here was somebody who'd come, who'd never been to English school, who'd never actually knew much English except domestic English, you see, home English. I mean, read things, but there weren't that many. And to manage within a matter of 2 or 3 years to get up to where I was when I got up to Cambridge was really quite an achievement for the school, I think. With the help, I must say, with the help of the public library, they now have got a public library, and I'm sure that anybody of my age, and perhaps even later, the public library was an institution which was absolutely central for really widening, for education as well as self-education. Fortunately, it was around the corner from the school, so I used to go to the library and get new books in the lunch break and all sorts of things. But the combination of a good teaching and the public library was really, I won't say it was a making of me, but I don't see what I would have done if I hadn't had this.
Were there any teachers at that school who you particularly remember as?
Oh yes, yeah, at that stage. I remember some of the German teachers. I remember, curious enough, I remember the German headmaster better now. was again, who on the whole was very critical. He criticised my style. In those days my interests were literary rather than anything else. Certainly not historical, because I mean the historical teaching at this German school was absolutely useless. You know, I mean, dates of German emperors and stuff like this. The terrible irony of the situation was the man taught us all this stuff, you know, going around saying, you know, Henry the Fowler, dates, you know, wham, you know, that kind of stuff, was actually an extremely distinguished ancient historian and archaeologist who had contributed, you know, to Pauli Wissewa, and who was at least as bored with the stuff that he was. But I was in too low a form to be able to recognize that these people really were prepared to talk. And they weren't yet prepared to talk to people at that age yet. Well, the headmaster was, in a curious way, he was almost immediately sacked by the Nazis as a Republican. Not that he was left-wing, simply but I remember those. I mean,
Were there any history teachers at the English school who?
The history teacher at the English school was not, I think, a particularly good historian, but he did everything he could for me. He was actually a man called Harold Llewellyn Smith, the son of the Llewellyn Smith who was a very big figure in the Edwardian civil servant and eventually the head of the New London Survey at the LSE. I mean, a very important figure, one of his sons, and in fact, liberal, who did everything. I mean, he had good connections. I mean, he used to send my essays to the Webs to check that kind of stuff. But I mean, he obviously had his books, which were available to those who was read. So he did his best. I didn't really learn very much history from him because it wasn't his kind of history. But at the same time, I mean, when I came to Cambridge, I discovered, you know, the stuff that was being taught there was totally different from anything that had been done in secondary school. On the other hand, I mean, without him, I would certainly not have gone to Cambridge. I mean, because he knew the ropes. He knew what to do to get scholarship, you know, to sit scholarship exams, whether it was, he gave me the right kind of tips. In Cambridge, you've got to put down King's first. In Oxford, you've got to put down Balliol first, you know, that kind of stuff, you know. So, from that point of view, he's really very, very decisive. Although, I mean, I got most interest in teaching not from him but from the English people, the English teachers.
Were there any other things you were doing at school by then, like debating or acting or music or other societies?
Well, yes, there was debating, sure. I mean, there was a debating club. I even at one stage won a debating cup. That was they tried to get me onto sports, but as I'd never done any cricket, and started off at 16. Also, I didn't show any great enthusiasm for it. It was not an enormous. Curious enough, in Germany, you see, I'd been very sporting. I did rowing. We had a marvellous boat club there. But in England, tried looking for the boat club again in Cambridge, and then I discovered that you're supposed to spend all the afternoon there, and that didn't strike me. I mean, however, no, I spent a good deal of time cycling and wandering around England and so on with a cousin who was my closest friends. I mean, and huge trips through the country, camping and all that kind of stuff.
Why did you? I mean, you went to King's and Cambridge because of the history teacher.
I went to King's and Cambridge because I won a scholarship. That was the first examination, and I got through the scholarship examination. Otherwise, I would have tried Oxford.
And what date was this that you went to King's? What date did you go to King's?
Well, I did the scholarship examination in '35, and I went up in '36.
Your teachers at that time, I mean, the generation of Oscar Browning had gone, and Christopher, was he then there by that time? Christopher Morris? Or?
Yes. Morris, Saltmarsh, and Balfour. Completely forgotten now. Of these, Saltmarsh was a genuine scholar, knew an enormous amount. I didn't learn as much as I could from him, but I mean, I admired him for sheer learning. Got something out of him. Christopher Morris was very good because he asked what he called was Socratic questions, which is quite good for bright undergraduates. What do you mean by when you say this? Checking out what you're trying to do. Didn't actually teach anything. No, the only persons that in Cambridge, I mean, I went around throughout all the lectures and tried them pretty well all at one time. The only ones that I really stayed with is Postine. Insofar as I can say that there was somebody in Cambridge that, as it were, if not influenced me, but I mean, was a teacher, there must have been Postine.
Just his lectures, he didn't supervise you?
Only when I got to be graduate. Then he was no good. Well, no, he didn't supervise. Well, I mean, after I graduated, he joined his sort of seminar and stuff like this, but basically it was lectures. And he was the man that all the really bright young historians went to. The economic. It was a marvellous act. He was a very clever man. I mean, a fantasist, or if you like, a liar. But whatever it was, one of his fantasies was that he knew everything. So there was never a question to which he claimed, I don't know the answer, which is very dangerous. As distinct from, say, I remember at one time going and talking in Harvard to Gerschenkron, who was also a Russian thing, and in some ways, at least, was more solid actual achievement, who didn't hesitate to say, if I ask him some questions, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Were there others at King's? I mean, this was the time of John Maynard Keynes and Provost Shepherd, perhaps, and were there any other King's fellows who, at that time, you came into contact with? E.M. Forster was probably there then.
No, not until after the war. I mean, I got to know Morgan after the war, pretty well, actually. I can't say, I mean, King's was enormously tolerant. even of not very good-looking people from grammar schools who were heterosexual, or at least who were not homosexual. But nevertheless, I don't really think in King's I was ever, as it were, socially, this was a time in King's socially riding very, very high, in the top, in the top lot. So I didn't really know very many of the fellows, seriously. I mean, I'm never invited to join the 10 Club and things like that, you know, that kind of thing. On the other hand, as between the various students, King's was particularly good because, I mean, you know, relationships were very close and very probably the best thing, historically speaking. The only other man in King's that had some kind of influence was old Clapham,
Yes.
who still presided over a thing called the Political Society, which was, as it were, a meeting of the history students.
Did they have the custom then that after a talk they handed round a purse and you had to pick out a number, and depending on which number you picked, you were the first person to ask a question or a second? This was certainly the case later on in the political society.
Can't remember, probably yes.
Mm.
I can't remember. The political society was very good.
Mm.
I mean, and because, I mean, you got together with it, and frankly, I find one learned much more from one's own contemporaries and from libraries at Cambridge. Particularly all these discussions which you had, you know, the socialists, the Marxists and so on, you know, that there was enormous amount of debates and talks and readings. So there's,
When did you become an apostle? Was it when you were an undergraduate or later?
I was the last election before the war.
So you'd left Cambridge, or
No, still in Cambridge.
Because that takes you into the higher echelons of...
Yes, that's when I discovered that there were higher echelons. Huh?
Yes. And were there any apostles who you got to know well at that time?
Well, I mean, I got to know much later because after that the war almost immediately started. So, I mean, in fact, I de facto restarted the apostles in Cambridge after the war because there were very few of the pre-war people left, and so to restart but the angels, the older members, were still around, and I got to know a lot of them then at that time. And very, very obviously Morgan Forster. But then all these various other fellows whom I wouldn't have known. I never met Keynes before the war, but then, of course, being neither an economist nor in the sort of social gratin, I wouldn't have.
You mentioned Morgan, and he's really in after the war, but perhaps it would be worth just dwelling on him in a moment now. What was he like?
Difficult to define. Certainly, I mean, he seemed a hangover from a past generation. I mean, both in his way, the way in which he behaved, his reactions. I think in some ways he, he had two really great loyalties. One, I think, was essentially to friendship, and the other, of course, being homosexual. There's, you know, that was enormously important to him in some ways. It's very interesting that you should ask me this question, because looking back, I can't really give him retrospectively a sort of shape. I mean, I can see his behavior, I can see him behaving, I can see him doing, I mean, my relations with him. I see him coming to visit me when I was ill, like up there in Gibbs Building, fairly regularly, truly. I don't think we ever really seriously talked about it. I can see myself taking him in London to things that would not normally be expected. You remember the Establishment Club? Huh? I took him to that, huh? And then took him back to his flat somewhere in the West, in Fulham or thereabouts. He was most polite and terribly nice. And
You got much more out of talking to other people and going to clubs and societies and the Labour Club and so on, and Marxist clubs. Was this when you became a Marxist, or?
No, no, I was Marxist, or I thought of myself as a communist, from the age of, well, from 1932. I was converted in 1932, when I declared I was a communist in my German school, and a schoolmaster whose name I sometimes can still remember, but I mean, I don't remember nothing else about him, asked me some questions and then said, "You clearly have no idea what you're talking about. Go to the school library and look up something," and I discovered the Communist Manifesto. That's what converted me both to Marxism and history.
Interesting. Well, it's such a large subject, I don't quite know how to approach it. But presumably at Cambridge you became a member of the party, did you? Or?
Yes.
I suppose the one question is, when you said that you were converted to both Marxism and history, and I remember Keith Thomas saying that basically the problem being a historian at Balliol with Christopher Hill was that if you didn't have a Marxist framework, you really didn't have any framework at all, which I thought surprising from him in a way. But basically, otherwise it's just chronological. Is that what you found in Marxism, a sort of an answer to the question of explanation and origins and why things...
Certainly. Oh, certainly. I mean, well, there were really two things. One is essentially, you might say, the evolutionary approach. Where do human beings come from in societies? How do they change until they get to where we are today? It still seems to me to be, I won't say it's the only kind of history, because anybody who writes according to certain rules about the past can say that he's writing history. But there is no way of understanding history without asking this question also. The other, which at that time preoccupied me much more, at least when I got to England, was the relationship between what Marx would have called base and superstructure, namely culture and, you know, what is it in a particular society which explains the particular shape of or formation of cultural events. How does this relate to the rest? I rejected the usual Central European things, zeitgeist and stuff like that. But basically that was the one historic question that I first posed to myself. But I quite agree with you. It was the fact that I couldn't think of anything else which offered a equally fertile, if you like, heuristically and to some extent intellectually fertile framework. And that's not only because it tied up with history, but it tied up with all manner of other things. I mean, I grew up believing that Marxism, as it were, was something which covers everything, you see. It's not where the history theory can be isolated either from natural science on one hand or from other disciplines or other areas of interest in the other. But that doesn't mean that I actually pursued this as a systematic. I've never pursued a systematic project in history. And this is a curious situation. Almost all the things that I've done in history have been, as it were, occasioned from outside, one way and another. And the thing that's given them unity isn't that I've set out to, you know, like saying, I am going to write the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, you know, like Gibbon, but that behind it there was a coherent picture of historical change and historical development, which is what I got from Marxism. And still.
When you say these projects came from outside, do you mean there was some accident, like you went to a seminar or your publisher said, or?
Yeah. Almost, I think, without exception.
Well, let's take two of your famous examples. Let's take the social banditry aspect.
Yes.
I mean, how did that emerge accidentally?
It emerged accidentally because I was going around mostly Italy and Spain at the time and being curious about this, that and the other and interested. And then the anthropologists in Cambridge and Manchester were interested at the time in various problems, apropos largely of Mau Mau. And Max Gluckman, I think, asked me at some time, he says, we're thinking about saying whether there was anything like Mau Mau in early European history. Could you come and talk to a seminar? So I looked around and thought of it and gave him a seminar. And then he said, why don't you come and give us some lectures of this in Manchester and do a colloquium? And various people there doing this kind of stuff. Norman Cohn was there, and others. So I gave a few lectures, and then he said, if I give you, get Manchester University Press to give you a contract, but you'll make it into a book. That's how it happened. And certainly all my books, and none of them, all of them came about this, and even my choice of research subjects. I mean, my original research subject would have been the agrarian problem in North Africa, because I got a travel grant in '38 for that, and was absolutely fascinated by it. Well, during the war, I mean, I couldn't do anything very much because I was called up in February 1940, so there wasn't really very much I could do before then. In the course of the war, I got married to somebody that I didn't at that time think I would want to leave to go after the war to spend some time in Algeria or something like this. So I had to look for something else. So I looked around desperately for something that could be done, or if need be, that could be prepared before the war ended. And I hit upon Fabian Society, where incidentally my old schoolmaster proved useful enough because he had all these Toynbee Hall and other connections. So I did that a bit. And then I discovered, I mean, in fact, eventually I discovered it was no good, it wasn't interesting enough. But in the course of doing this, I've been hunting around the LSE and discovered the web collection. And the web collection, which is actually showing us about how trade unions actually worked at that time. They knew more about it than anybody else. And it was marvellous because Industrial Democracy, which is the book they wrote about it, is, in my view, the best book ever written about British trade unions. And I discovered, right, that's the angle of labour history I want to take. Not the societies, not the official, the history of events, but the history of these structures at the bottom. So I did that and developed along that line. Then, the other books, almost invariably, I mean, the 19th century trilogy was a straightforward, George Weidenfeld thought he might risk it. It was just past the worst period of the Cold War. And so I did that, and it worked out, the first volume worked out quite well. It was mostly based on what I was lecturing on, so, it was easy enough.
You were at Birkbeck, right?
Yeah, I was Birkbeck throughout.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I had 5 years in Cambridge too, but I couldn't get a job there, so I gave a few lectures there, but I mean, I couldn't get a job in Cambridge. I had some job difficulties. And then, again, in most cases, it's people come and say, why don't you write a book on this?
What about for example, the invention of tradition? I know that was...
No, that was an idea of my own, but I then organised a conference for past and present. We discussed it and organised this conference, and then after that they said, well, why don't Terry and you get together and because originally, I mean, I've got a few of these odd ideas, but I wouldn't normally have done, have set about specifically doing it. I mean, I wouldn't mind stimulating other people to do it too, which is actually what I did there. So there are two different things. On the one hand, it's accidental, if you like, pure unplanned. On the other hand, there is to some extent an intuitive element in it. I mean, I think I am, in some respects, in my choice of interests, there's a good deal of intuition in it rather than planning, which may actually explain why I've managed, with luck, to hit on a number of, so to speak, hit the right moment. You see, I mean, the Primitive Rebels business, for instance, lots of people were working their way in that way. But when this book came out, it actually hit the right moment. And somewhat to my surprise, it had quite a lot of influence, not so much in this country, but I mean in the social science in America, let alone the students, you know. And such phrases like social banditry and so on, which became, you know, that doesn't mean that, that it was right, but the idea somehow or other was in the air. And by the intuition made me kind of get around to doing it just about that time. Another example is the 17th century crisis, which began as a sort of well, essentially a problem that I ran into when I was doing European history lectures. It didn't seem very satisfactory. But having talked to a lot of people, the French and the other people, I sort of felt now this has got to be thought about. And got it published. And again, this had surprisingly wide and lasting effect. It isn't dead yet because, I mean, only 2 or 3 issues ago, the American Historical Review had a review, you know, a return to the 17th century crisis, you see. Again, the phrase was mine, actually, so far as I'm aware, even though the thing wasn't mine. I mean, it's implicit in Baudel, I suppose, but certainly in some other French people that I know. Inventional tradition is a similar thing. Something I sort of vaguely thought around, but at a certain stage people took it up. Nationalism is, again, I mean, you know, I mean, I wasn't the only man by any means to do that in the 1980s, but you know, it's that time, you know. I mean, it happened that I got to do these Belfast lectures, you know. And so what subject does one pick? One goes to Belfast lecture, one picks nationalism, and that's the way it grows. So, that's been really my main contribution, I think. Partly pushing ideas, or at least pioneering ideas, and partly working out syntheses. And synthesis, again, is not mine, but inspired by all sorts of people, but essentially Marx. without marks. I wouldn't, thought of it, doing it that way, or indeed possibly succeed in doing it that way.
Can I mean, there are many things I'd like to follow up there, but you mentioned the webs, and I was very influenced by my apprenticeship and the appendix on method and one fact, one card, and so on. So I wondered how exactly you work. I mean, how do you research? Do you have card indexes? And how do you write?
I did a bit of card indexing, not really an awful lot. I used to work mostly with notebooks, which would then be indexed to some extent, so I could find back what I've done again. Relying to some extent on having good memory, which unfortunately is now no longer the case. How do I write?
Do you write on a typewriter, or do you handwrite, or?
No, I wrote on the typewriter really almost from the word go, 20 years or so, on a computer.
Do you revise a lot, or do you just more or less write it down in the first draft? It's fairly clean.
No, it's not clean, because I mean I keep, it varies a lot, but no, I mean one's got to revise, but the trouble is it's too easy to revise on a computer. Revise and re-edit. Mostly I've been lucky enough that my editors haven't really interfered too much, so they haven't interfered in my text. On the other hand, the autobiography, where I had Stuart Profit of Alan Lane, who was an absolute prince among editors, he read it and he was very helpful, and because I had to cut that down very severely.
Do you enjoy writing?
Yes, if it goes well.
Do you write? I mean, what? I know that music has been important in your life. Does it play any part at all? Some people are inspired by music, or write to music, or listen to music first and then write. Is there?
No, I would have said it probably gets in the way. It's a very personal business. I mean, my friend Chuck Tilley, a sociologist, wrote and worked to persistent, constant music. I couldn't possibly do that. I have to stop and listen, I think. Well, I like writing. I mean, I try, and obviously one of the things I try and specifically to write in a communicable fashion. I mean, the basic test which one's doing as a lifetime of teaching, particularly teaching people who spend most of their day working, therefore not particularly lively, is you've got to keep them awake. Huh? The test, my test is always, can you keep them awake in the 8 to 9 lecture at night after they've done this? And the same thing goes for the writing. So I mean, to this extent, having had some journalistic experience is useful, even though I'm not a natural journalist.
This was the journalism of writing about jazz, or other things as well? Anything.
I mean, ever since I was on Granter in Cambridge, I edited it at one time, yes. I've been, you know, writing bits and pieces sometimes. But the idea of writing to length and to deadline, but particularly writing to length has been very useful, you know.
I was wondering, it's a bit different. I've asked a lot of scientists who have a moment when they see a relation or something very clearly, about those, in the cliche, eureka moments. I was wondering whether you have your best moments away from your writing, or walking, or in the, you know, listening to music, or in the bath, or whatever, or whether it's you work it out when you are actually writing.
Mostly when I'm writing, I mean, I sometimes think about what I'm going to write. If at all, probably walking, not in the bath. Probably talking to people. This is one of the big problems. You talk to people, in a sense, you want to be very careful to acknowledge what you go, and it's, for practical purposes, it's not easy, sometimes impossible. I mean, it's easy enough if, for instance, I acquire some stuff, some information that I didn't know, say from a student. Say a student from some remote part of the world tells me about things I didn't know. That's easy enough to say, well, now this is a point made to me by, you know, Mr. Jokic or whatever it is. But it does so much of the thing, depends on interchanges, possibly interchanges of the past. That one's always afraid, you know, that one, because after all, if you like, one's priority in, or at least one's own right to one's own ideas is a fairly important thing in our trade. But I don't think I've been accused of copying too much.
I mean, that relates to your teaching. As you mentioned, you learn a lot from your students and from teaching. Do you enjoy supervising and certainly lecturing?
Lecturing I used to be very good at. I'm not so sure about supervising. I've got a feeling, as far as students are concerned, they might or might not get a lot from hearing me talk, you know, and developing ideas and things like that in front of them. But I don't think I've been particularly good at actually getting them to do it themselves. When I've supervised, say, PhDs and so on, I mean, I obviously sometimes give them ideas, but I find that a lot of the time I have to give them technical advice, saying, no, okay, you've got to, you know, how to do it, how to make certain that you do something that you can do within 3 years, you know, that kind of stuff, which is not, which is pedagogic but not an intellectual contribution. Uh, difficult to tell, but I mean, I certainly used to enjoy, and I still enjoy it to some extent. I enjoy talking. I mean,
Yes.
to people.
I was wondering, well, perhaps we ought to come back to the chronology a bit. During the war, you were obviously called up. Were you in England all the
Yes,
time?
all the time.
Yeah.
They wouldn't let me out, you see. And I suspect that I had an MI5 file.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I suspect I already had an MI5 file, although my attempts to get at my MI5 file have been total failure. But I mean, there has been one, but the question is when it started. And certainly it was already there, in my view, during the war. But it was there before the war because I was a very prominent Communist Party person in Cambridge. So,
So they wouldn't let you out of the country, but they did let you into the arms.
The official line is, it would have done. I could have gone only by a bureaucratic sort of mix-up, as happened, for instance, with James Krugman, whom the security people didn't want to let out of the country, but for some reason or other, he was already on the troop ship going somewhere else, and they couldn't get him back.
And then after the war, I mean, we're skipping on, but I don't want to keep you too long, but after the war you came back to Birkbeck, or did you come back to Cambridge?
No, I came back. I mean, I had no connection to Birkbeck.
You came back to Cambridge?
I came back to Cambridge. I mean, I came back to Cambridge because in early 1946, having had a really boring and unnecessary war, of which of course I approved naturally, I was supposed to be sent, of all things, to Palestine, or something or other, and I figured it was too bloody complicated to send a Jewish communist at that stage to Palestine in 1946 or thereabouts. So I wrote to King's and said, you know, could you say, because I had this studentship, can you get me back? And they got me back. So I started doing what was then going to be a fellowship dissertation, and but within a year I got this job at Birkbeck, and stuck there basically. Although when my first marriage broke up, I moved back to Cambridge, where I had a fellowship at that time for a few years.
Who were the people at Cambridge when you went back for those few years? By that time, Christopher was quite getting on, I suppose, a bit.
Well, there were one or two people. I mean,
was Edmund Leach there by that time? Maya Fortes?
Maya was, yes, certainly. Jack Gallagher was back in Trinity at that time, and one or two other people. Boston, of course. But my dealings were really mostly with the economists, because I supervised and examined economic history for the economic stripers for a few years there. I didn't get a job, but so I had more contact then with you know, Nicky Caldor and Morris and Srafa and Joan Robinson and Richard Kahn and the younger people, you know, Harry Johnson and all these people. got that.
Seems surprising you didn't get a job either the first time or the second time, so to speak. I mean, you don't think that...
Politics.
Yes, I was going to say.
Yes, it was politics.
I mean, was it the politics of communism or the politics of Judaism? Or
No, I don't think Judaism comes into it, no. To the best of my knowledge, I've never felt that I had any kind of discrimination as a Jew. No, I think it was politics. It was also partly, I think, yes, I mean, maybe local politics, because there was this curious political division within the Cambridge economics faculty. Whatever it is, it was lucky for me that I got the job, because the cut-off point for Reds during the Cold War was, roughly speaking, May 48, the Berlin airlift. If you got a job before then, an academic job before then, you were okay. You couldn't expect to get much promotion for about 10 years or so, but you were okay. If you weren't, you had enormous problems. Best of my knowledge, hardly any known communists got academic jobs in those 10 years. Well, you could say Edward Thompson, but that was in the adult education part of Leeds, which isn't quite the same thing. But I think the communism part in Cambridge, yes, well, there were at least 3, possibly 4 jobs in the economics faculty which I was in, including, of which 2 were clearly inferior. The one who I thought was a reasonable appointment over me was Ken Berrell, who was a friend of mine, and we remained very good friends. Later on, he offered to give me the same job after the change within the faculty, and I said, it's a bit late now. And then eventually I was in for the chair, which again, David Jocelyn got in this case. But, you know, the curious business is that institutionally in England, the Cold War was present. But the curious thing is that, as far as I'm aware, it hardly impinged on the actual intellectual field of history. I mean, whether people got a reputation, both in this country or elsewhere, not merely among people that sympathized with them, but in general, you know, in the field, I don't think that was at all affected by the Cold War.
Let's, in the last 5 minutes, what I would like to ask you, which I ask many people, is, well, 2 questions. One is the relationship between your political life and your historical life, because that seems to be where Marxism joins together 2 parts of your life in a way which made it meaningful. I mean, which would you consider your more important aspect of your life, as a historian or as a political commentator and journalist?
Well, as a historian, although as it so happened, as a committed historian, I mean, a politically, and one that is in quite a large number of places regarded as were politically committed historian. I mean, my actual political activities as such are of no particular moment. The history books have actually been quite, I won't say influential, but symptomatic. I've noticed, for instance, that you can very often test the change in the political atmosphere of particular countries by the extent to which, or the moment at which the people start translating my books. In Spain, this began to happen in the 1960s, later 1960s, as Francoism was wound down, you see, which is at a time when it's perfectly clear the great bulk of university people, students, were passionately opposed, and it proved to be possible to publish the works of people who weren't actually called Marx or Lenin. In Brazil, the real testing point came in the early 70s, which is just about when the generals began to become, the generals' dictatorship began to be slightly liberalized, or the tension. I discovered by sheer chance, for instance, that in Korea, when I came to Korea in the late 80s, they already had about they pirated 5 of my titles, but this was just about, I was just about there at the moment where it was going over from dictatorship over towards the, the end of the thing. The same thing must have happened in Taiwan, but I don't know, I've never been there. In Turkey, for instance, it's quite clear that since the 1990s, this has been happening. Now, you see, to this extent, in one or two, I don't know, because in some countries, like for instance Argentina, until they actually published an enormous amount of this stuff was done by those pirated Xeroxing and stuff like that. But for a lot of these, now this had 2 effects. Part of the time, but partly also that the people that then became radicalized, the young student generation, would eventually become the editors, the publishers, the ministers, the thing. So to that extent, you see, in that way, therefore, books like mine had some kind of impact. More in some countries than others, dramatically so in Brazil, which is for some reason my best market. It's so incredible, and become part of whatever it is, the official textbooks for the diplomatic academy as well as for all the other things like that. So, but they did so largely because in fact they were readable. And I think that's the importance, you see, the importance of trying to walk the tightrope between, on the one hand, remaining or being acceptable to one's colleagues within the field, and at the same time understandable to that ideal type, the educated citizen. The non-educated citizen, I mean, below that kind of level, I don't think I've known how to talk to much or had much effect on. That effect, I think, is easy. The actual, my effect on the within the field is much harder to test, and I don't think I'm the person to estimate that.
We'll leave it to posterity. And I think perhaps at that point, Eric, we should, sadly, but these conversations can go on forever. So thank you very much indeed for
Well,
lovely.
thank you.